Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to jump into the deep end.
Well, today we're going deep on something a little different. We're looking at, well, let's just say interesting claims attributed to Donald Trump.
Interesting is one word for it.
Yeah. We got a ton of requests from listeners to dig into this Wikipedia page that's dedicated to tracking all these statements, and
It's quite the rabbit hole.
it is. And it's not just about politics. We're talking everything from Trump's businesses to the White House years, even some stuff about his family history, which,
Some of it's pretty wild.
yeah, I was surprised by some of the stuff in here. So to help us wade through all this, we've got expert speaker here who's, well, let's just say, an expert at separating fact from fiction.
I'll do my best. It's definitely a challenge with this particular topic.
No kidding. So let's start at the beginning, before the presidency even. Back when Trump was primarily known for his business dealings, the whole art of the deal era. Seems like even back then, there was a bit of a gap between his public statements and, well, reality.
Yeah, there are definitely some patterns that emerge early on. Take, for example, what happened after the 1987 stock market crash. Trump was very public about claiming he'd sold off all his stocks and avoided major losses.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
But when you actually dig into the SEC filings, those documents companies have to file with the government to report their financial status, they tell a very different story.
Oh, so he was still holding on to a bunch of stock.
Yeah, a substantial amount, actually. And journalists who were tracking his financial moves at the time estimated his losses to be somewhere between $19 and $22 million.
Wow, that's not exactly dodging a bullet.
Not even close. And this tendency to downplay any financial woes, it wasn't a one-time thing either. When reporters would ask him about his net worth or his debt, Trump consistently presented a much rosier picture than what the evidence seemed to support. There's this quote from a banker who worked with him in the late 90s that I think really sums it up.
Okay, let's hear it.
He said Trump had a mastery of situational ethics and an inability to differentiate fact from fiction.
Wow, strong words from someone in the world of finance.
It's pretty telling, and it speaks to this pattern of shaping the narrative, presenting himself in a certain light, regardless of what the underlying reality might be.
Right, and it's not just about money either, right?
Yeah.
We see the same kind of pattern in other areas of Trump's life, too, like take his time with the New Jersey General football team.
Oh, that's a good one. Remember that whole thing with the infamous press conference?
Vaguely. Refresh
Yeah.
my memory.
So, CNN reporter Keith Olbermann told this story about how Trump promised to sign all these superstar players and coaches to the Generals. He was going to revolutionize the team, make them a force to be reckoned with.
Sounds like classic Trump hype.
Exactly. But the press conference he'd promised, the one where he was going to announce all these big names, never happened. Olbermann even said that Trump approached him afterwards and basically contradicted everything he just said publicly, but with a whole new set of outlandish claims.
It's like he was putting on a show, playing to the audience.
It's certainly interesting to think about it that way, and it's important to remember this wasn't just some football sideshow. At the time, the USFL, the league the Generals played in, was in the middle of a lawsuit against the NFL. Antitrust case, really high stakes.
Right, I remember that. It was a big deal.
And Trump himself testified about his conversations with NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle, claimed that Rozelle had offered him an NFL franchise if he agreed to keep the USFL as a spring league and drop the lawsuit.
Well, that would have been a sweet deal for Trump.
Except Rozelle completely denied ever making such an offer. There were multiple accounts from people who were actually at that meeting who said Rozelle was totally against the idea of Trump owning an NFL team.
So again, we have the situation where Trump is presenting his own version of events, even when it directly contradicts what other very credible people are saying.
It's a pattern that definitely emerges early on. And this tendency to project an image of success, regardless of what's really going on behind the scenes, it shows up in a lot of different areas. It's not just about business and sports either. There are some pretty interesting claims out there about even basic things like his education.
Oh yeah, what about that whole thing about him graduating first in his class from Wharton?
Exactly. Easy enough to debunk that one. Just look at the commencement program from his graduating year. No honors, no mention of him being top of the class.
Okay, that's pretty clear cut. But what about that story he's told about almost getting on that helicopter that crashed and killed 3 of his casino executives? Surely you can't just make something like that up.
Well, a former vice president of the Trump Organization actually came out and said that Trump wasn't even supposed to be on that helicopter.
So even in a situation with such a tragic outcome, there's still this blurring of the lines between what actually happened and what he's presenting as reality. It's kind of unsettling, you think about it.
It is. And it's not just people who worked directly for him who noticed this tendency. TV personality Billy Bush, you remember him.
Oh, yeah.
He once challenged Trump about constantly claiming The Apprentice was the top-rated show, even though the actual ratings data showed otherwise.
Oh, I remember that. What did Trump say?
His response was pretty telling. He said, Billy, look, you just tell them and they believe it. That's it.
Yeah.
You just tell them and they believe. They just do.
Wow, that's quite the philosophy. Like, he thinks he could just shape reality through sheer force of will.
Right. And it's not just an isolated anecdote either. Several people who interacted with Trump professionally have expressed similar concerns about his relationship with truth. Alaire Townsend, a former New York City official and publisher, she famously said she wouldn't believe Donald Trump if his tongue were notarized.
That's a pretty strong statement.
And Susan E. Mulcahy, who worked for the New York Post, she described him as a great character, but full of crap 90% of the time.
It's like everyone around him was in on the joke, except maybe the general public.
Right. But maybe one of the most intriguing examples, and definitely one of the weirdest, is this whole thing about Trump's Swedish heritage. You'd think knowing your family history would be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's not like you could just choose your ancestry, so what's the story there?
Well, it seems to stem from his father, Fred Trump. During and after World War II, when anti-German sentiment was high, Fred started claiming he had Swedish ancestry, probably to downplay his German roots.
Ah, trying to avoid any potential backlash. Makes sense. But why would Donald keep perpetuating this?
That's the thing. He didn't just mention it casually. He actually wrote about it in his book, The Art of the Deal. Claimed his grandfather came here from Sweden as a child.
But in reality,
Both of Fred Trump's parents were born and raised in Germany. No Swedish connection whatsoever.
okay, that is pretty wild. And what makes it even weirder is that he later became a big proponent of that birtherism conspiracy theory about Obama, right?
Exactly. Questioning Obama's birthplace, his legitimacy as president, it's just incredible ironic. Accusing Obama of hiding his true origins while doing the exact same thing himself.
Okay, that is some next-level hypocrisy.
Wow.
It makes you wonder, where does deliberate deception end and maybe just a skewed perception of reality begin?
That's a tough one. And speaking of The Art of the Deal, we should probably talk about Tony Schwartz.
Oh, yeah, the ghost writer.
Yeah.
He's the one who later became pretty disillusioned with Trump, right?
Big time. He basically helped create the public image that launched Trump to fame, but later came to deeply regret it. He even compared working with Trump to putting lipstick on a pig. Right. And Schwartz even coined this term, truthful hyperbole, to describe Trump's communication style. Basically presenting things in a way that sounds impressive but is ultimately misleading or untrue.
So basically just a fancy way of saying a lie.
Pretty much. And Schwartz later admitted that truthful hyperbole was just a way to sugarcoat it.
That's pretty damning coming from the guy who helped craft Trump's public persona.
It definitely makes you think. And it highlights the challenge of trying to separate fact from fiction, especially when you're dealing with someone who seems to have such a fluid relationship with the truth.
So if this was all going on before he became president, it makes you wonder, what happened when he actually got to the White House?
Well, that's when things get really interesting. During his presidency, the sheer volume of false or misleading statements reached a level that's pretty much unprecedented in modern American history. The Washington Post fact-checkers, they actually kept a running tally.
Oh, wow. What did it add up to?
A staggering 30,573 false or misleading claims over just 4 years in office.
Wait, 30,000? Seriously?
Yep. That's an average of about 21 false or misleading claims per day.
That's mind-boggling. Even if you take away some for, exaggeration or misspeaking, that's still an insane number.
It's a level of dishonesty that's pretty alarming. James Comey, a former FBI director, he actually called Trump a serial liar.
Wow. And I remember Brian Stelter, the media analyst, arguing that this constant barrage of falsehoods was a deliberate strategy.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about getting away with saying things that weren't true. It was about undermining the credibility of anyone who might challenge him. The media, experts, political opponents.
So by flooding the zone with so much misinformation, it becomes almost impossible to tell what's real and what's not.
Exactly. It creates this environment of confusion and distrust, which makes it much easier to control the narrative.
Okay, so let's get into some specific examples from his presidency. I mean, there's so many to choose from. Where do we even begin?
Well, we got to talk about the inaugural crowd size thing, right? That was a classic.
Oh, yeah. The one where he insisted his inauguration crowd was the biggest ever.
Yep. Even though there were photos and videos clearly showing that wasn't true. Then his press secretary, Sean Spicer, held a press conference doubling down on those claims, which just made the whole thing even more ridiculous.
And then, of course, there was Kellyanne Conway with her, what was it, alternative facts?
Yes, the alternative facts, a truly Orwellian moment. It basically boiled down to this idea that truth is subjective, that there can be multiple valid versions of reality, even when the facts clearly contradict those versions.
And to top it all off, we later found out that a government photographer admitted to editing pictures at Trump's request to make the crowd look bigger.
It was a whole saga, and as crazy as it was really just a preview of what was to come.
Right. We've only just scratched the surface here. 30,000 misleading statements, you said. We've got a lot more ground to cover.
Buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. It really does feel like you could write a whole textbook on the art of Trumpian communication.
The Trump playbook.
Exactly. And it's not just about these big headline-grabbing events. There was this constant stream of misleading statements throughout his presidency across all sorts of topics, really. Like, remember his claims about the U.S. economy?
Oh, yeah, the best economy ever, right?
He said it so often, best in history. It's like you almost started to believe it. But when you actually look at the data,
It wasn't all that, huh?
it wasn't even the best in recent history. Not even close. And what about that promise to eliminate the national debt in 8 years?
Oh, right. With a nearly $20 trillion debt when he took office.
Yeah. Not only was it unrealistic, it was basically impossible. And the deficit actually went up significantly during his presidency.
So much for fiscal responsibility. Okay, so economy, national debt. What other policy areas were impacted by these, let's call them creative interpretations of the truth?
Well, how about immigration? Remember all that talk about the border wall?
Oh, yeah. Build a wall was a big one.
Yeah.
And Mexico will pay for it.
Right. Well, Mexico never paid a dime. And despite all those claims about the wall being almost finished,
What, it wasn't?
most of the construction was actually just reinforcing or replacing stuff that was already there. Very little was actually new wall.
So again, this big gap between what was being said and what was actually happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's his signature policy, the family separation policy.
Oh, that was a dark chapter.
He actually tried to blame that on Obama.
Seriously.
Yeah, said it was Obama's policy that he was just continuing.
But that's not true, right?
Not at all. Experts have confirmed that systematically separating families at the border was a direct result of the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy. There was no such policy under Obama.
It's almost like he was trying to rewrite history to fit his own agenda.
It's a pattern we see again and again. And there was that time he made those comments about his presidential authority, claimed that Article 2 of the Constitution basically gave him the right to do whatever he wanted.
Oh, right. I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. Didn't that cause a bit of a stir?
Yeah, legal experts were quick to point out that no, Article 2 does not give the president unlimited power. It's a bit more complicated than that.
It seems like he was constantly pushing the boundaries of truth and power, using his words to try to shape reality rather than reflect it.
And nowhere was that more evident or more concerning than during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, yeah. The pandemic was a whole other level of, well, everything.
From the very beginning, he was downplaying the threat. We have it totally under control. It's going to disappear, things like that.
I remember those early press conferences.
And then he made that claim about testing, said anyone who wanted a test could get one.
But that wasn't true at all, was it?
Not even close. Testing was incredibly limited in those early days.
And then there was all that back and forth with Dr. Fauci.
Right. He kept contradicting the advice of his own health experts. Remember that interview where he suggested injecting disinfectant?
Oh, God, yeah. Medical professionals were freaking out.
And then there was his resistance to wearing masks, spreading misinformation about their effectiveness.
It was all so bizarre looking back. And dangerous.
Yeah. It had real-world consequences. A partisan gap in death rates emerged after vaccines became available, and a lot of that can be attributed to vaccine skepticism.
Which Trump definitely contributed to.
Without a doubt. It's a stark reminder that words have consequences, especially when they're coming from someone in a position of power.
And it wasn't just about COVID, right? This pattern of sowing distrust extended to the election as well.
Absolutely. The attacks on mail-in voting, that was huge. He kept claiming it was rife with fraud, despite zero evidence. Even Christopher Wray, who he appointed as FBI director, said there was no evidence of any coordinated national voter fraud effort.
But he was already laying the groundwork to challenge the election results, no matter what happened.
It seemed that way, and then after he lost, he just doubled down on these baseless claims, which culminated in, well...
January 6th?
Yeah, a pretty dark day for American democracy.
Even in the face of all the evidence, he still insisted the election was stolen. even suggested that Mike Pence could overturn the results.
Which is just not how any of this works. The Constitution is pretty clear on that.
But even after the violence of January 6th, he downplayed it, called it a completely unarmed protest, suggested the real insurrection happened on Election Day,
It was almost like he was condoning the violence.
and further eroding trust in the democratic process.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, he didn't stop after leaving office.
He's still going on about the stolen election.
Oh, yeah. And it's like his claims have become even more out there. Remember that thing about all the psychiatric patients from some unnamed South American country being sent to the U.S.?
Oh, yeah, I remember that. That was wild.
His campaign couldn't provide any evidence when CNN asked about it. And then there's his constant talk about crime being out of control, even though FBI stats actually show homicides are down.
It's like he's living in some alternate reality where facts don't matter and fear is the driving force.
And it's a tactic that's worked for him before, especially when people are already feeling uncertain and anxious.
Then there's the whole AI thing. That just adds another layer of complexity.
You mean when he attacked Kamala Harris for supposedly using AI to fake a crowd at a rally?
Yeah, that one. Which was quickly debunked, by the way.
By multiple news outlets who were actually at the rally. But then, not long after that, he started posting his own AI-generated images and videos. There was that one with him dancing with Elon Musk.
Oh, God, I think I saw that one.
And then another one that made it look like he had Taylor Swift's endorsement.
It's like he's intentionally trying to blur the lines between what's real and what's not. Make it even harder for people to figure out what's true.
And after Hurricane Helene, he spent days spreading lies about the federal response.
Remember that. Saying Biden wouldn't take calls from the Georgia governor, that Kamala Harris stole FEMA funds, that nobody was being rescued.
It was just a whirlwind of misinformation.
Yeah.
And it was all demonstrably false.
But it created this whole cloud of confusion and distrust right when people needed accurate information the most.
Exactly. And it's like, was he intentionally trying to make the government look bad? To sow chaos?
It's hard to say, but it was definitely damaging. And what's really scary is that, according to a recent poll, a majority of Americans believe that Trump and his campaign rarely, if ever, tell the truth.
Wow. That's a pretty damning indictment.
It speaks to the level of distrust he's created.
So we've gone from exaggerating business deals to spreading falsehoods about national crises. And it's like this pattern of distorting reality has just gotten worse over time.
Like a snowball effect.
Right. Each misleading statement builds on the last one, creating this alternate reality that's completely disconnected from the facts.
Okay, I need a break from all this doom and gloom. Can we talk about something a little lighter? Maybe some examples of these misleading statements in other areas of his life.
Well, there was that time he made those comments about childcare costs.
Child care, really?
Yeah, it was during an interview about his tax plan. He claimed he was going to tax foreign countries and bring in trillions of dollars. So much money that childcare expenses would basically be nothing.
Trillions. That's optimistic.
It was pure Trump. Big promises, grand gestures, no real substance. And for parents struggling with childcare costs, it probably sounded pretty good.
Even if it was completely unrealistic.
Exactly. It's the danger of oversimplification, the appeal of easy solutions to complicated problems.
But when those promises don't pan out, it just creates more disillusionment and distrust.
Right. So what can we do about all this? How do we combat this erosion of truth and protect ourselves from being misled? Especially when it's coming from people we're supposed to be able to trust.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
There's no easy answer, but I think it starts with awareness. We have to be more critical of the information we consume. Can't just take everything at face value.
So more fact-checking,
Yeah.
more digging deeper.
Exactly. We need to question our assumptions and be willing to consider different perspectives, even if those perspectives challenge our own beliefs.
And we have to hold our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. Demand evidence. Push back against falsehoods. Support organizations that are working to combat misinformation.
This is a pretty heavy topic. I'm starting to feel a bit overwhelmed by all this. Like, where do we even begin to address this problem? It seems so huge.
I know it can feel that way, but I think the first step is just acknowledging that it is a problem. We can't just shrug it off and pretend it's not happening.
We have to be willing to talk about it.
Exactly. To have those tough conversations about truth and lies and the future of our democracy.
Well said. Maybe if we shine a light on these misleading statements, we can start to chip away at the problem.
Awareness is definitely key. And hopefully, by understanding the patterns and the motivations behind these statements, we can be better equipped to navigate this whole crazy information landscape.
That's a good point. It's not about dwelling on the past. It's about learning from it, using that knowledge to build a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We can't change what's already happened, but we can choose how we respond to it. It's like we've stumbled into some kind of dystopian sci-fi movie.
Right, where up is down and black is white and truth is, well, whatever's trending on social media.
It's not just politics either. We're seeing this wave of misinformation everywhere. And these social media algorithms, they're not helping. They prioritize engagement over accuracy. It's all about clicks and shares, whether the information is true or not.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm left wondering, like, what does it all mean? For us as individuals trying to navigate this crazy world,
Yeah.
how do we make sure we're not falling for these misleading narratives?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with awareness. We have to be more critical of the information we're consuming.
So not just passively scrolling through our feeds, accepting everything as gospel.
Exactly. We have to be willing to question things, dig a little deeper, not just take everything at face value.
And what about holding our leaders accountable?
That's crucial too. We can't just let them get away with saying whatever they want, regardless of whether it's true or not.
So we have to demand evidence, push back against falsehoods, support organizations that are trying to combat this misinformation.
Exactly. This is a fight for truth, for the very soul of our democracy. We can't afford to sit on the sidelines.
You know, after all this, I can't help but wonder, like, what happens if enough people believe a lie? If it gets repeated often enough, does it eventually become the accepted truth?
That's a scary thought. And it speaks to the power of narrative, of repetition. It's why critical thinking is so important. Media literacy, being able to have open, honest conversations about these things.
Well, this has been a fascinating and at times pretty unsettling deep dive. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I know I've learned a lot.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope everyone listening has too. The more we understand about these patterns of misinformation, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this complex world.
Well said. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. We'll see you next time for another Deep Dives.